Hey everyone, I'm going to be doing some watercolor cherry blossoms using a Winsor Newton palette, and I have two brushes, a thin one, it is a round 1, and then I have a thicker one which is a round 5, both Winsor Newton. I really like the feel of these brushes. They're easy to use and easy to clean. So to start, I'm going to sketch out my stem, leaving space for some of these little blossoms. So I'm going to put the little blossoms, just little tiny marks, nothing crazy, don't get too detailed, and then lightly sketch out the stem there. You'll see this come together in a second here. So now I just want to accentuate the stem so that I can see where I'm working here and where to leave space for the blooms. And now I'm ready to go in with some color. I'm going to pull in a light brown, and you'll see it on the side of the palette there. A little bit of brown, a lot of water, a little more brown, a lot of water. You want to go in with a light layer of brown first. Maybe put a little bit of Payne's Gray in there to darken it up, but a light layer with a lot of water so you get a light brown layer first. It's all about layering when you go in with these little tiny details. So basically just filling in the lines, making sure to leave some space and get in those little tiny corners by the blooms. We're going to really let this light brown layer kind of sit there for a second, and it's just going to be our base for this stem. Now I'm going to bring in a little bit of a darker color and start thinking about where the shadows might be in my photo. So bringing in a darker color, and I've decided that the light is coming from the top right, and it's going to be shining down essentially to make the shadow on the left side of everything. So if it's shining that way, all my darkness is going to be on the left bottom side of my cherry blossom. So I'm just putting in another light layer of dark, getting a tiny bit of water, a tiny bit of color on my brush, and just kind of going over that left bottom side. You want it to look organic, so don't worry if you get some weird little marks in there. And I'm going to kind of put some darkness underneath where those cherry blossoms are going to be to give the idea of a shadow, and that the stem is underneath it. So underneath the points at which the cherry blossom are going to fall, notice I'm really darkening that part of the stem. And I'm just placing water in the already existing wet stem. Placing water and color, in fact. So now I'm going to take and start putting in some color for the blooms. And notice I was pointing out those spots that are still wet on the stem. You want to make sure you avoid those when you put your new color in. So I'm bringing in a light pink, a lot of water, a little bit of white. I don't use white very often except for cherry blossoms because I really want to start with a light pink. You don't want to go too dark too soon. My dog just dropped her bone. So now I'm going to go in, and I call these parentheses, and I make 5 parentheses and just lightly fill it in, leaving space. So that's my first set of parentheses. That's one petal. Here's my next parentheses, but look how careful I'm being around that wet stem. I'm using my thicker brush here, my round 5, but you could easily go to your smaller one. It doesn't hurt to go smaller. If you go too big, you're going to have too much water on there, and it's going to release too much pigment onto your flower, and you won't get to control those spaces as much. But this is a wet on dry technique. And notice I'm really being careful. I just don't want that brown to bleed into my pink. If it does, don't worry. It looked kind of cool. You can even just sop it up with a paper towel if you're disappointed in it. And there's my 5th parentheses. And I'm leaving that white space in there to give the illusion of light and color and petals. And now I'm going to move on to my second bloom. That's Shadow chewing her bone in the background, by the way. She has to make an appearance. So this is my fourth set of parentheses on this bloom. I'm going in with my fifth, leaving that white space in the middle. I needed more color, so I brought in that same pink, a little bit more white, and a lot more water. It's a little bit darker, but not a big deal. You can just add a little bit of water to it. It'll soften it up. And these little guys at the end, just throw some color on there. Don't worry about creating a little circle. The more organic, the better. Now I'm bringing in a dark pink again because now while the blooms are wet, I want to come in and just place some color in the existing wet area to give it some interesting darker points, some contrast. This is where I would say probably use your smaller brush just to get into those little nooks and crannies. Let that dry for a little bit. Now I'm going to go in with some more darkness to my stem while my blooms are drying a bit. So the left side is where I'm placing the color, that darkness, and notice each layer just got darker and darker. If you go too dark too quick, you lose the ability to make these kind of layers and really give it some depth. That's Shadow drinking her water in the background. So now once again, I'm going to go in underneath those petals and I'm going to make it a little bit darker where I want that shadow to give the illusion of a shadow. So darkness underneath here. You don't have to have a ton of water on here. It's kind of nice to blend in those existing points. Still being really careful you're not touching that pink part because the blossom will bleed into that brown and then you may not like the result. So I'm just taking that little brush and making little tiny dry details, nothing too wet. I'm going to go in darker still, brought in a little bit of Payne's Gray. And I'm just placing color underneath those cherry blossoms to make it look like they're sitting on top of that branch. Making little nodules to give it a very organic stick effect. All right, now I'm going to bring in some darker pink still so I can start giving some really good shadows. Now, the cherry blossoms are still wet, but they're not soaking wet. So the color is going to move on its own in there, but it's also going to stay fairly isolated. But you'll notice I'm just placing some color to the left of each petal to give that illusion of shadow. Placing it to the left, and you'll see how the color still has some movement. This is my favorite part of watercolor. Now, if you notice, if something happens where you place this color down and the whole thing turns that darker pink, just mop it up with a little paper towel and go back in again once it's a little bit more dry. So now I'm going to let this kind of sit for a few moments and start thinking about some new details, perhaps some leaves. So bringing in a green, keeping it really light to start, remember? Everything you do, you want to prepare for layers, so keep it light at first. If your blooms are still wet, you want to make sure you're working around those. And I like to give my flowers a little bit, or my leaves, a little bit of kind of curve, because we can make some really cool shadowed effects that make it look like it's bent, kind of hiding underneath the other part. I'll show you how to do that. So just make a little bit of a curvy leaf. Has a little bit of a tip there. They don't all have to be curvy. You can just bring them in. This is a wet on dry method again, so I have full control over how much water I'm applying to the paper and exactly where the color goes. Now, I'm going to let those leaves dry. I'm going to go in with my darker pink still. Notice how dark that is. But now that my blooms are fairly dry, that color is really going to stay only where I put it. And this is what, our fourth layer of pink? And it just shows you that little bit of depth you can get when you keep adding little tiny layers of darkness. Now, I'm going to go in with a darker green. I brought in some Payne's Gray to my existing green, and I'm going to go make some shadowed effects. So if you imagine the leaf is kind of bent over, that means that one part of it will be darker than the other. And so you'll see it's still kind of wet, but I wanted to give you the full video now. You'll see that I'm going to just darken up a piece of each leaf. And a little trick, if you're getting a green that's a little too fake, you can always add its complementary color into it to kind of mute the color. So while if you do too much of it, like down in that pink, it looks almost brown. If you do just enough, like up in the green, it'll have a nice muted, really organic color. So now I'm going to be putting the shadow to the left of this curve and giving the illusion that it's kind of flipped up. This one isn't going to have any flip, so I'm just going to darken underneath the petal. Well, that one is still going to have a flip. So I'm just going to darken underneath where that cherry blossom is, give it the idea of a shadow. Keep it loose, keep it organic. I'm going to go in and soften that out later. Darken up that color there. Make sure you're still not touching the pink if it is still wet. And now this guy. So at this point, I realized I've accidentally darkened the part I did not want to darken. So what I'm going to do here, this is a perfect example of fixing your mistake. I'm going to take some paper towel and I'm going to actually mop this up because that dark part, it is really not what I wanted there. So I'm going to take a little piece of paper towel, mop it up, go in with my dark, and start again because I wanted the flip side to be underneath instead. Remember, my leaf is still pretty wet, so I'm not going to get a very concise, or I should say, definitive line. You're going to see that color bleed in together, and that's perfectly fine. Still has that organic, loose look. I'm going to go in and kind of soften up these lines a little bit. Put some darkness underneath that bloom so it looks like it's sitting on top of the leaf. Softening up these lines. And now that my blooms are pretty much dry, I'm going to come in and add a little orange and yellow to the center. So I brought in this burnt orange, and I'm going to bring in some yellow on top of it to really lighten it up. And then just place some color in the middle there. If your blooms are still wet, it's perfectly fine. I think a little orange bleeding out into those petals will look kind of cool. And here are your 15-minute cherry blossoms.